The problem facing the Allies in early 1943 was not how to invade Europe, but how to do it without being destroyed in the attempt. An assault on southern Europe was coming, and everyone knew the obvious target was Sicily. The Germans knew it. The Allies knew the Germans knew it. That mutual understanding made surprise impossible, unless reality itself could be rewritten. Inside a small office of British naval intelligence, the solution took a form that felt both absurd and precise. If the enemy could not be moved by force, they would be moved by belief. The plan required a body, a false identity, and documents convincing enough to outweigh every other signal. This was not a battlefield deception. It was an intimate one, built on paperwork, habits, and assumptions about how officers thought. The body came first. A recently deceased man, unknown and unclaimed, was given a new life after death. He became Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, complete with rank, background and purpose. His pockets were carefully filled. Personal letters, receipts, keys, even romantic correspondence. Nothing was random. Every item was designed to survive scrutiny and feel casually authentic. The documents he carried mattered most. Official letters hinted that the Allied invasion would strike Greece and Sardinia, portraying Sicily as a diversion. The language was deliberate, confident but careless, as real secrets often are when shared between senior officers. The letters were not marked for German eyes, they were written to be accidentally discovered. Delivery was as critical as content. The body was released into the sea from the British submarine HMS Seraph, positioned so currents would carry it to the Spanish coast near Huelva. Spain was officially neutral, but German intelligence operated freely there. The planners understood human behaviour. The documents would be read, copied, and quietly passed along before being officially returned. When the body was found, everything unfolded as expected. Spanish authorities recovered the papers, handled them just enough to leave traces of inspection, and passed them back to the British. London feigned concern, politely requesting the return of sensitive material. Behind the scenes, intelligence officers examined the documents for signs they had been opened. They had. German command accepted the story. Troops were shifted. Defensive preparations were reinforced in the Balkans. Sicily's garrison was weakened at precisely the wrong moment. The deception worked not because it was elaborate, but because it fit German expectations. The false narrative aligned perfectly with what they already believed the Allies should do. When Allied forces finally landed in Sicily in July 1943, resistance was lighter than anticipated. German reinforcements were elsewhere, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The body of a man who had never known the war had reshaped its course, not through action, but through credibility. In Operation Mincemeat, the most decisive weapon was not secrecy, but the careful construction of a lie, convincing enough to be trusted. The invasion plan pointed towards Sicily, long before the first landing craft was assembled. Its position dominated the central Mediterranean, controlling sea lanes, air routes, and access to mainland Italy. Taking the island would crack the Axis defensive line and open the way north. But its importance also made it obvious. Any competent enemy would expect an attack there, prepare for it, and bleed the landing force white. German planners were not guessing blindly. They had watched Allied movements in North Africa, studied shipping patterns, and followed diplomatic signals. Sicily sat at the crossroads of all that intelligence. Fortifications were strengthened, airfields reinforced, and mobile reserves held ready. An invasion without deception would not be a battle of manoeuvre, but a direct collision with prepared defences. The problem was scale. An amphibious landing could not be hidden. Thousands of ships, aircraft and troops had to move into position, and those movements would be detected. Surprise could not come from secrecy. It had to come from misdirection. The enemy did not need to be unaware, only convinced to look somewhere else. German command, including Adolf Hitler, was deeply concerned about the Eastern Mediterranean. The Balkans, Greece, and even Turkey loomed large in strategic thinking. An Allied landing there threatened oil supplies, Axis allies, and the southern flank of Europe. That fear created an opening. If intelligence confirmed those anxieties, Sicily could be reframed as a secondary target. This was why the trick had to be perfect. A weak deception would be ignored. An exaggerated one would raise suspicion. The story had to feel natural, almost careless. It needed to match how real officers talked, how real plans leaked, and how real secrets were mishandled. The enemy had to believe they had discovered the truth themselves. Timing mattered as much as content. The deception had to reach German intelligence early enough to influence troop deployments, but late enough to prevent reconsideration. Once divisions were moved and defences adjusted, reversing those decisions would take time the Axis no longer had. The lie needed to lock the enemy into a wrong posture at exactly the right moment. When the invasion finally came, German forces were divided in their attention. Sicily was defended, but not with the strength originally intended. Units that could have counterattacked the landings were elsewhere, waiting for an assault that never came. The trick worked because it exploited expectation, not ignorance. The objections came quickly and for good reason. Bodies decompose unpredictably. Currents cannot be commanded. Neutral authorities might mishandle the find or refuse cooperation. German intelligence might see through the ruse instantly. Every step relied on human behaviour, behaving exactly as expected, which in war was never guaranteed. The idea sounded less like strategy and more like a gamble dressed up as planning. Yet the impossibility was also its strength. No rational enemy would expect a real plan to be carried on a real body and then deliberately lost. Deception usually hid behind complexity. This plan leaned into simplicity. It assumed that if the story felt mundane enough, an accident, a tragedy, a minor lapse, then it would pass through scrutiny rather than attract it. The impossible idea relied on plausibility, not cleverness. Details turned the idea into something workable. The fictional officer needed a name, habits, and a life that could survive examination. Letters had to sound casual, not official. Personal items had to look worn, not staged. Even mistakes were designed into the story, because real people make them. The planners understood that intelligence analysts trusted what looked human more than what looked perfect. The method of delivery mattered as much as the content. The body would have to appear where German intelligence could reach it, without British fingerprints all over the discovery. The coast of neutral Spain offered exactly that space. From the submarine HMS Seraph, the body could be released with just enough distance to make the outcome feel accidental rather than arranged. Skepticism lingered until the planners tested the smallest assumptions. Would paper survive immersion? Would seals show tampering? Would the Spanish authorities quietly share information with the Germans? Each answer came back cautiously positive. Not certain, never certain, but possible. And in deception, possibility was often enough. What finally tipped the balance was a recognition that every alternative carried greater risk. A direct assault without deception meant higher casualties and a stronger enemy response. Conventional ruses had already been used and countered. The impossible idea, precisely because it violated expectation, offered a way to redirect attention at the highest levels of enemy command. The man had to exist before he could be trusted. A name alone was not enough. The planners gave him rank, service branch, habits, and minor flaws that felt authentic rather than impressive. He became William Martin, a major in the Royal Marines, ordinary enough to escape suspicion and important enough to carry sensitive papers. Every detail was built outward from that identity. His wallet contained mundane objects, receipts, ticket stubs, keys that opened nothing of consequence. These were not decorations, they were signals. Intelligence officers knew that spies fabricated documents well, but rarely bothered with the clutter of everyday life. The clutter made the identity breathe. Letters mattered most. One from a superior officer referenced operations in a way that felt informal, even careless. Another came from a fiancé, impatient and affectionate, written in a tone that suggested irritation over postponed plans, rather than concern over global war. The emotional texture was intentional. Personal relationships anchored the identity in something real. No one questioned a man who seemed loved. Even inconsistency was planned. Some documents were slightly creased. Ink showed signs of wear. Dates overlapped imperfectly. Nothing aligned with parade ground precision. The planners understood that real lives are untidy, and that intelligence analysts trust disorder more than symmetry. Perfection would have betrayed the lie. The uniform was chosen with the same care. Rank insignia matched the papers. Buttons showed mild wear. Nothing looked newly issued. The body itself, unfortunately necessary, had to support the narrative of an accidental death, not violence. Medical details were adjusted to ensure the cause of death would align with exposure at sea, avoiding questions that could unravel everything. Placement completed the illusion. The briefcase was chained to the wrist, not because an officer would do so routinely, but because in moments of concern people act irrationally. That small choice suggested urgency, not theatricality. The man was portrayed as someone protecting documents hastily, not staging a deception. By the time the body was ready, the officer existed fully, on paper, in objects, in implied relationships. German intelligence would not discover a ruse. They would discover a life cut short. And because that life looked convincingly unfinished, the secrets it carried felt authentic. The success of the operation depended less on forged information than on empathy. Analysts would reconstruct the man before evaluating the message. Once they accepted who he was, what he carried became believable by default. The fake officer worked because he was never presented as fake, only as human, ordinary, and tragically real. The documents were written to look as though they were never meant to be read by an enemy. Their tone was informal, almost careless, as if exchanged between officers who assumed privacy. The language avoided precision where it mattered most, relying instead on implication. References to future operations hinted at landings aimed toward Greece and Sardinia, while Sicily appeared only as a secondary concern. Nothing was stated outright. The deception depended on what readers would infer rather than what they were told. Each page carried weight beyond its words. Paper stock matched standard military use. Ink bled slightly where it should. Signatures were familiar enough to pass recognition without inviting comparison. Even the folding of the letters mattered, creased in ways that suggested repeated handling. Intelligence officers trusted artifacts. that showed signs of use. Pristine documents raised suspicion. Worn ones invited belief. Placement was deliberate. The papers were sealed inside a briefcase, chained to the wrist, a choice meant to suggest anxiety rather than theatrical security. Officers under pressure improvised. That small detail implied urgency. A man worried about losing documents during a routine flight, not staging an elaborate ruse. The chain made the discovery feel accidental, not arranged. The route to German eyes was indirect by design. Released from the submarine HMS Seraph, the body drifted toward the Spanish coast, where neutrality masked quiet collaboration. Spanish authorities followed procedure just enough to leave traces of inspection. The papers were dried, resealed, and returned, exactly what British planners wanted. Those traces mattered more than confirmation. They showed the documents had been opened. German intelligence evaluated the material as they always did. By context, first, content second. The story aligned with their expectations of Allied strategy and their fears about the Eastern Mediterranean. The letters sounded like how senior officers actually wrote when they assumed no one else was listening. There were no dramatic claims, no perfect clarity. The lack of emphasis made the message stronger. Cross-checks followed, as expected. Signals intelligence and reconnaissance were weighed against the documents. Nothing directly contradicted the false narrative. In intelligence work, absence of contradiction often counts as confirmation. The papers did not stand alone. They nudged analysts toward conclusions they were already prepared to accept. As the assessment circulated upward, the documents gained authority. Troop movements were adjusted. Defensive priorities shifted. The deception took effect not because the papers were extraordinary, but because they were ordinary enough to be trusted. A handful of pages, planted carefully and read in the right frame of mind, redirected attention at the highest levels without ever announcing themselves as a trap. The submarine surfaced quietly in the early hours, its dark hull barely visible against the Mediterranean night. Aboard HMS Seraph, the crew worked without ceremony. There was no salute, no speech, no pause for reflection. The operation depended on routine. Anything unusual would risk turning a carefully planned accident into an obvious act. The body lay prepared, dressed as William Martin, complete with uniform, papers, and the briefcase secured to his wrist. The sea air was cold, and the weight of the moment was practical rather than emotional. This was not disposal, it was delivery. The man had a destination even if he would never know it. Positioning mattered. The submarine released the body at a precise point off the coast near Huelva, chosen for its currents and its politics. Spain's neutrality created the perfect ambiguity. Officials would follow procedure, but German intelligence would not be far behind. The planners trusted geography as much as psychology. Water would do the rest. The body slid into the sea without sound. No splash loud enough to echo. No movement once it disappeared beneath the surface. From that moment on, the operation left British control entirely. Currents, tides, and chance now carried the deception forward. Every mile drifted increased uncertainty and authenticity. Days later, fishermen found the body washed ashore. The discovery unfolded exactly as predicted. Local authorities recovered the remains, examined the contents, and began the slow process of notification. The briefcase was opened, dried, and resealed. Hands that were never meant to leave marks did so anyway. Those marks became proof. The documents travelled through quiet channels, copied and evaluated before being officially returned. British officials expressed concern just convincingly enough to reinforce the illusion. They asked politely for the papers back as though anxious about an unfortunate loss, rather than a successful deception. Every reaction was part of the script. Once the body entered enemy hands, it no longer needed protection. Its purpose was already fulfilled. A man who had never lived out his false identity had completed his role, not through action, but through placement. The sea had carried him to the right shore, and belief took over from there. The documents did not arrive as a revelation. They arrived as confirmation. Inside German intelligence channels, the papers recovered from the coast were treated cautiously at first, passed from hand to hand, examined for inconsistencies. Analysts focused less on the claims themselves than on the circumstances of discovery. A drowned officer, personal letters, official correspondence that looked careless rather than staged. The context did most of the convincing before the content was fully assessed. German intelligence officers reconstructed the man before they reconstructed the plan. They noted his rank, his apparent responsibilities, the informal tone of the letters he carried. Nothing suggested a deliberate plant. The absence of obvious security markings made the documents feel genuine. Real secrets, they believed, were often handled imperfectly. That belief lowered defences more effectively than any forged stamp could have. The narrative aligned smoothly with existing fears. The Eastern Mediterranean already occupied a large space in German strategic thinking. The Balkans, Greece, and the Aegean were seen as vulnerable points that threatened oil supplies and Axis cohesion. When the documents hinted at an Allied focus there, they reinforced what planners already worried about. Intelligence that confirms expectation is rarely questioned for long. As reports moved upward, confidence grew. Cross-checks were performed, but nothing contradicted the story strongly enough to raise alarms. Allied movements in North Africa could plausibly support a strike eastward. Diplomatic signals, shipping patterns, and radio traffic all appeared ambiguous enough to fit the false narrative. In intelligence work, ambiguity often becomes evidence when it points in a desired direction. At the highest level, decisions followed belief. Adolf Hitler was personally convinced that the Allies intended to strike in the Eastern Mediterranean. Orders were issued to reinforce defences in Greece and the Balkans. Divisions were repositioned. Resources were committed to meeting a threat that existed only on paper. Sicily, by contrast, was treated as a secondary concern. Defences remained, but the sense of urgency diminished. Mobile reserves that could have countered an invasion were now tied down elsewhere. The deception did not eliminate German resistance, it diluted it. That dilution mattered more than absolute surprise. What made the bait irresistible was not clever wording, but coherence. The documents did not scream deception, they whispered plausibility. German intelligence did not feel tricked, they felt informed. By the time doubts surfaced, the machinery of command had already moved. Troops do not relocate instantly. Belief, once acted upon, becomes difficult to reverse. The Germans took the bait because it matched how they thought the enemy should behave. The deception succeeded by respecting the enemy's logic, rather than challenging it. In that alignment, false information became operational truth, and a dead man's papers quietly reshaped the battlefield. Orders began moving before doubts could settle. German units received instructions to prepare for redeployment toward the Eastern Mediterranean, away from Sicily and toward Greece and the surrounding regions. Rail timetables were adjusted, supply priorities rewritten, and defensive plans redrawn. None of this happened suddenly, but once set in motion, it gained its own momentum. Divisions that might have reinforced Sicily were reassigned inland and eastward. Armoured units were repositioned to counter a threat that intelligence reports now treated as imminent. Coastal defences in the Balkans were strengthened, airfields expanded, and garrisons reinforced. Each movement felt logical when viewed in isolation. Together, they shifted the strategic balance away from the real point of attack. Commanders on the ground adapted to their new expectations. Training focused on mountainous terrain and defensive warfare against landings in Greece or Yugoslavia. Patrol patterns changed. Reconnaissance flights were redirected. Sicily remained on the map, but it no longer dominated planning discussions. Attention, once divided, became focused in the wrong direction. Logistics followed belief. Fuel, ammunition, and engineering assets were allocated to the reinforced fronts. Moving them back would take time, even if orders changed. In war, resources are not abstract. They travel slowly, constrained by rail capacity and supply chains already under strain. Every shipment sent east was one that could not be quickly recovered. The effect was cumulative rather than dramatic. Sicily was not stripped bare, but it was weakened. Mobile reserves that could have counterattacked Allied landings were now too far away to respond in time. Units stationed on the island lacked depth and flexibility. When the invasion came, commanders faced it with what they had, not with what they had planned for weeks earlier. German intelligence continued to monitor the situation, but the initial assumption shaped interpretation. Signals that might have suggested Sicily was the real target were filtered through the belief that it was a diversion. Once a narrative takes hold, contradictory details tend to be explained away rather than confronted. The wrong front remained the focus. By the time Allied forces landed, the redeployment had already done its damage. Troops stood ready in Greece and the Balkans, waiting for an assault that never arrived. Sicily faced the invasion with reduced support, slower reinforcement, and fewer options. The battlefield had been reshaped not by firepower, but by movement. Movement, guided by a story the enemy believed to be true. The redirection of troops did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be sufficient. In war, absence matters as much as presence. Units that were not there could not fight, and the distance they had been sent ensured they would arrive too late to matter. The landings began along the coast of Sicily under difficult conditions, but not under the weight of the resistance planners had feared. Allied troops came ashore expecting heavily concentrated German counterattacks, layered defences, and rapid armoured response. Instead, they encountered positions that were thinly held, unevenly organised, and slow to react. The absence was not immediately obvious, but it shaped every hour that followed. German units on the island fought where they could, but they lacked depth. Many formations were under strength, and reserves that should have been positioned to strike the beaches were not close enough to intervene. Orders had to travel through disrupted command channels, and by the time decisions were made, the situation on the ground had already changed. The landings expanded faster than anticipated, not because they were flawless, but because resistance failed to consolidate. Italian forces, already strained and demoralized, offered limited opposition in many sectors. German commanders attempted to compensate, but their ability to maneuver was restricted. Air support was inconsistent, and coordination between units suffered from the broader strategic confusion created in the weeks before the invasion. What should have been a tightly contested entry turned into a series of fragmented engagements. As Allied forces pushed inland, the pattern continued. Defensive lines were established hastily and abandoned just as quickly. German counterattacks occurred, but they were localized rather than decisive. Without sufficient mobile reserves, each effort stalled before it could alter the momentum of the advance. The island's rugged terrain slowed movement, but it did not stop it. Intelligence reports soon confirmed what the troops were sensing. German strength on Sicily was lower than expected, and reinforcements were delayed or misdirected. Units stationed in Greece and the Balkans remained on alert for an invasion that never came. The strategic error had translated directly into tactical weakness on the beaches and beyond. The Allied advance benefited not from surprise alone, but from imbalance. German forces were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs, committed to a defensive posture shaped by false assumptions. Even determined resistance could not compensate for missing divisions and delayed responses. The landings gained momentum not through overwhelming force, but through opportunity. As the campaign progressed, the reduced resistance became a defining feature of the operation. Sicily did not fall without fighting, but it fell faster than it should have. The island became the first major proof that deception had reshaped reality. When Allied troops secured their foothold, they were stepping into a battlefield already altered, quietly and decisively, before the first wave ever reached shore. The body entered the war without ever knowing it. Dressed as William Martin, it carried no weapon, no orders, and no awareness of its role. Yet every detail, from the uniform buttons to the papers in the briefcase, had been engineered to function with lethal precision. Once released into the sea near Huelva, control ended. The deception depended entirely on how others would react. When the corpse washed ashore, it triggered procedures rather than suspicion. Spanish officials followed protocol, documenting the find and examining personal effects. The briefcase was opened carefully. Letters were read, dried, resealed. Nothing about the process felt extraordinary, and that ordinariness was essential. The body did not announce itself as a ruse. It presented itself as a tragedy. German intelligence encountered the documents not as bait, but as opportunity. Analysts focused on context. A drowned officer, an accidental loss, sensitive papers handled too casually. This was how real mistakes happened. The deception succeeded because it mimicked incompetence rather than brilliance. Real secrets, they believed, often leaked through human error. The corpse did something armies struggle to do. It redirected attention. The false papers convinced German command that Allied forces would strike Greece and the eastern Mediterranean, not Sicily. Divisions moved. Defensive priorities shifted. Fuel, aircraft, and men were committed to the wrong front. All of it flowed from the credibility of a dead man's story. Unlike bombs or bullets, the weapon worked silently. No explosion marked its success. No battlefield report recorded its impact. The effects appeared weeks later in thinner defences, delayed reinforcements, and confused command responses. By the time Allied troops landed, the corpse had already done its damage. The body itself never returned. It was buried quietly under its false name, its role complete. No medal marked the contribution. No citation recorded the outcome. Yet the invasion it shaped unfolded under reduced resistance, saving lives that would have been lost in a direct confrontation. In this war, steel and firepower mattered, but belief mattered more. The corpse became a weapon because it convinced the enemy to act against itself. Without firing a shot, without ever drawing breath, it altered the balance of an entire campaign. In a conflict defined by destruction, one of its most effective weapons was a carefully constructed death.